presentation is about population and the environment. For thousands of years, the population has had little growth and has remained relatively small. It was only until 1804 that 1 billion people populated the Earth. Nowadays, that number is near 7.7 billion, according to a recent report by the Pew Research Center, and it continues to grow. As such, it's easy to see why sustainability has become an important topic in the field of demography. Beginning with the works of economist and demographer Thomas Malthus, the extent of our planet's carrying capacity has commonly been debated for over 100 years. According to a report conducted by the UN Environmental Program, various studies estimate that range to be anywhere from 500 million to more than 1 trillion people. So far, we have no way of knowing for certain, but what we do know is that population size, as well as resource consumption, play major roles in determining how many people the planet can sustain. By disregarding these issues, we intentionally damage our environment and contribute to climate change on a global scale. Despite the overemphasis of large cities in developing nations, smaller to medium-sized cities are actually experiencing much higher rates of growth. In fact, about 88% of all urban residents living in cities with populations over 100,000 live in these small to medium-sized cities. A rather low proportion of people actually live in the so-called megacities of these developing nations. This paints a completely different picture as to how the urbanization process is usually portrayed in Latin American, African, and Asian countries. This is troubling as growing cities and towns in developing nations are continually neglected by both demographic research and, more crucially, by their own local governments. All in all, this generally means that smaller cities are less well provided and often suffer from a lack of basic services such as fresh water supply and sanitation. Furthermore, a lack of educational opportunities is responsible for the high fertility rates commonly found in these areas. The implications of Mark R. Montgomery's The Urban Transformation of the Developing World becomes clear when seen at the global scale. Simply put, the urbanization of poor countries often outpaces the adoption of environmentally friendly practices and infrastructure. This means that developing nations may have much laxer environmental regulations than developed ones that do have the infrastructure in place to support eco-friendly options. As a result, the least and most developed countries typically contribute the least to pollution. It is those that are in the middle that use unsustainable practices to support their rapidly growing populations. According to the Australian Academy of Science, the result includes, and I quote, the development of slums, poor environmental regulation, and higher levels of centralized pollution. Furthermore, in their research concerning the Middle East, the Academy found that since 2011, unplanned migration as a result of the refugee crisis has put a large strain on the environment. The large-scale movement of people from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan to refugee camps has affected water supplies, caused land damage, and has even polluted environments. This real-world example gives a compelling insight into how migration may place pressures on growing cities and their resources. According to the UN Refugee Agency, problems such as these are capable of causing a range of localized environmental problems. Now, although developing countries usually take center stage in discussions of carbon emissions and pollution, developed nations deserve some of the blame as well. They might not have such large populations and cities clouded in pollution, but they are largely responsible for the accelerating climate change of today. This is why, as I mentioned earlier, some estimates of our planet's carrying capacity may vary. In fact, a recent report by the University of Michigan Center for Sustainable Systems found that the average middle-class American consumed 3.3 times the amount of food and 250 times the amount of water necessary for simply surviving. As you can clearly see, population consumption plays an equal, if not more important role than population growth. Yet it has become second nature for most of us to consume excess amounts of goods and resources on a daily basis. This consumer culture is actually a recent development in human history with major implications on the environment The result of mass producing goods for developed countries comes in the form of excess pollution and huge amounts of waste. Multinational corporations such as PepsiCo and Nestle also play a role in this process. Although, as Margaret Thatcher put it, and I quote, "We must resist the simplistic tendency to blame modern multinational industry for the damage which is being done to the environment. Instead, we must look to them for solutions." Although multinational corporations often do pollute the environment, they will hopefully encourage technical innovation and become part of the solution. Margaret Thatcher's speech to the United Nations General Assembly explains why, in that, quote, "Industry will develop safe alternative chemicals, biodegradable plastics, and will find the means to treat pollutants and make nuclear waste safe." She continues to make the argument that corporations won't be able to profit if pollution continues to destroy our planet. In this way, as people look for more eco-friendly alternatives, industry will respond by producing more environmentally safe goods. This will require a change in behavior at the individual level, however, and this can be achieved through education. This approach involves informing people about their actions and how they may damage the environment. In poorer countries, education about sexual health and contraceptives would likely lower fertility rates. Governments should especially play a larger role in both these solutions by becoming more involved with corporations and enacting eco-friendly policies. Governments may drastically reduce the amount of waste that is produced. At the international scale, governments should comply with organizations like the UN to more efficiently reach climate goals. The limitations to these solutions are that multinationals and governments rarely have incentives to adopt eco-friendly practices. Although governments may serve to enforce environmental policies on multinationals, they often benefit from the productivity of the corporations themselves. Furthermore, the international organizations that should hold these countries accountable have proved unreliable in the past, as is the case with the UN. The UN has made it a priority in its development goals to take a stance on climate action, yet very little has been done to achieve that goal. Despite population growth elsewhere, we have the ability to make a difference in the world. Through our actions, no matter how small, we have the ability to combat climate change and help preserve the environment for generations to come. Thank you.
Okay, Alejandro. First question. How did you handle the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
So I handle two different perspectives of population growth and overconsumption by explaining how they both contribute to environmental sustainability. At first, I analyzed how urbanization continues to play a major role in developing countries. Through both migration and a natural rate of increase, the population continues to grow, and it's often at the expense of the local environment. On the other hand, I analyzed how consumption has come to plague developed nations, like the US, with consumer cultures. I then came to the fact that these nations contribute to environmental decay by contributing to unsustainable practices, and I concluded that both of these perspectives are valid and that they both must be addressed in order to effectively combat climate change.
And second question. What might be the real-world implications or consequences, influences on others' behaviors or decision-making processes of your findings, and what are the implications to your community?
So, considering one of my solutions involved changing a culturally accepted behavior, I'd say my conclusions definitely have consequences. For one, increased education and how we are harming the environment may convince people to adopt an environmentally friendly lifestyle, and this will include consuming less goods and resources and may drive consumers towards more eco-friendly products. This will lead to shifts in market demand, as Margaret Thatcher predicted, and might drive heavy polluting corporations out of business. Within my community, I'd say there will be a similar effect. If people here were to make more environmentally conscious decisions, our whole community will benefit because of it.